On a quiet autumn morning, detectives arrived at a crime scene unlike anything they had ever encountered. There were no signs of forced entry, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, just one haunting clue left behind in plain sight. A clue so strange that investigators couldn't explain why it was there. At first, it looked like a case that would be solved within days. Instead, it would consume the lives of detectives for the next 20 years. Some retired before they ever saw the truth. Others became obsessed with finding the person responsible, because every time they believed they were finally close, the case slipped away again. And when the truth was finally uncovered, it shocked even the investigators who had spent 2 decades chasing it. On the morning of April 1st, 1988, what should have been an ordinary spring day in the small town of Grable, Indiana, turned into every parent's worst nightmare. 8-year-old April Tinsley had left home the afternoon before to visit a friend's house, just a short distance away. It was a route she had taken before, one her family believed was safe. But she never made it back home. As the hours passed, concern quickly turned into panic. Her family searched the neighborhood. Friends and neighbors joined the effort. Soon, local police officers were knocking on doors, hoping someone had seen the little girl. No one had. By nightfall, the search had grown into a massive operation. Volunteers combed fields, checked wooded areas, and searched every place they could think of. Detectives refused to believe she had simply vanished. Then, the following day, the investigation took a devastating turn. A man driving along a rural road made a discovery that would shock the entire community. April's body had been left in a ditch, miles from where she had disappeared. Investigators immediately secured the scene, knowing they were dealing with something far more sinister than a missing person case. The area was carefully examined inch by inch. Forensic teams searched for footprints, tire tracks, fibers, anything that could identify the person responsible. But the killer had left almost nothing behind. There was no obvious murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no immediate suspect, only a heartbreaking crime scene and a grieving family desperate for answers. As detectives interviewed neighbors and retraced April's final movements, they realized something deeply unsettling. Whoever had taken her seemed to know exactly what they were doing. This didn't appear to be a crime of impulse. It looked planned. Every passing hour made the trail colder. Yet investigators refused to give up. They believed that somewhere, someone had seen something that could break the case wide open. What they didn't know was that the person responsible wasn't finished. In the months that followed, a series of disturbing messages would begin appearing around the community, messages that would terrify residents and haunt detectives for decades. As investigators worked around the clock, they hoped someone would come forward with the clue that could identify April's killer. Instead, the case became even more disturbing. Months after the murder, residents of Grable, Indiana, began noticing strange handwritten messages appearing in public places. Some were attached to road signs, while others were left where people would easily find them. At first, they looked like random notes. But when detectives read them, a chill swept through the investigation. The messages claimed responsibility for April's murder and contained disturbing details that had never been released to the public. Whoever wrote them seemed to know far more about the crime than anyone else. Fear spread quickly through the community. Parents stopped allowing their children to walk alone. Schools reminded students to travel in groups, and neighborhoods organized watch patrols, hoping to protect their families from a killer who appeared to be watching from the shadows. Detectives immediately collected every letter and every sign, sending them to forensic experts for examination. They searched for fingerprints. They analyzed the handwriting. They examined the paper, the ink, and even microscopic traces that might reveal where the materials had come from. But every test led to another dead end. The writer had been careful, very careful. As months turned into years, investigators interviewed hundreds of people, followed countless tips, and eliminated suspect after suspect. Each new lead brought hope. Each one ended in disappointment. The case refused to let go of the detectives assigned to it. Many of them carried April's photograph in their case files for years, determined that one day they would identify the person responsible. Then, nearly 7 years after April's murder, the investigation took another terrifying turn. A young girl riding her bicycle discovered another anonymous message. This one wasn't about the past. It hinted that the killer was still there, still watching, and still capable of striking again. For detectives, it was the moment they realized they weren't just investigating an old murder. They were hunting a predator who had managed to stay hidden in plain sight. Years passed, but the investigation never truly stopped. Every detective who inherited the case started in the same place, reviewing thousands of pages of reports, photographs, witness statements, and forensic evidence collected in 1988. They hoped the previous investigators had missed something. But each time, they reached the same frustrating conclusion. The evidence wasn't enough. Leads came in from across Indiana and neighboring states. Some callers claimed they had seen suspicious vehicles near the area where April disappeared. Others believed they recognized the handwriting from the anonymous messages. Detectives followed every tip. One by one, they were eliminated. As the years turned into decades, the case became one of Indiana's most haunting unsolved murders. New investigators joined the department, while others retired, but before leaving, many made one promise. Don't let this case be forgotten. April's family never stopped hoping. Every anniversary of her murder reopened old wounds. They spoke to investigators, appealed to the public, and prayed that someone, somewhere, would finally come forward with the truth. But the person responsible remained silent. Then, in the early 2000s, forensic science began changing the way cold cases were investigated. Detectives realized that the biological evidence collected decades earlier could now be examined using techniques that simply didn't exist in 1988. The evidence was carefully removed from storage. Every item was handled with extraordinary care. Scientists worked to develop a complete DNA profile, hoping it could identify the killer. The results were promising. But there was one major problem. The DNA didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database. Once again, the investigation hit another dead end. Still, detectives refused to give up. They believed it wasn't a matter of if the killer would be identified. It was a matter of when. What they didn't know was that a revolutionary investigative technique was about to transform the case forever. A method so powerful that it would lead detectives directly to a man who had spent nearly 3 decades living an ordinary life, while hiding one of Indiana's darkest secrets. By 2018, nearly 30 years had passed since the murder of April Tinsley. The case had become one of Indiana's most haunting unsolved crimes. Many of the original detectives had retired, but they never stopped thinking about the little girl whose killer had vanished without a trace. Then, a new generation of investigators decided it was time to try something that hadn't existed when the case began. It was called investigative genetic genealogy, a groundbreaking technique that had recently helped solve other cold cases by identifying suspects through distant family DNA matches. For detectives, it was one final chance. They carefully submitted the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene, hoping it would connect to someone, somewhere. Weeks passed. Then the phone rang. The results didn't identify the killer directly. Instead, they pointed investigators towards several people who appeared to be distant relatives of the unknown suspect. It wasn't the answer they needed, but it was the first real lead in decades. Genealogists and detectives worked side by side, building enormous family trees that stretched back generations. They spent countless hours comparing birth records, marriage certificates, census documents, and public records. Slowly, one name began appearing again and again. A man who had lived quietly for years. A man with no idea that investigators were getting closer every single day. Detectives knew they couldn't make an arrest based on genealogy alone. They needed one thing that would stand up in court: his DNA. So they began watching him from a distance. They documented his daily routine, where he worked, where he drove, where he stopped. They waited patiently for the perfect opportunity to collect something he had thrown away, an item that could legally provide the DNA sample they needed. It was a risky operation. If they were wrong, months of work would collapse. If they were right, one of America's longest-running cold cases was finally about to be solved. For weeks, detectives watched their suspect from a distance. They couldn't question him. They couldn't arrest him. Not yet. Every move had to be carefully planned. One mistake could alert the suspect and destroy nearly 3 decades of work. Then, the opportunity they had been waiting for finally arrived. Investigators observed the suspect throwing away an item he had recently used. Once he walked away, detectives legally recovered it and rushed it to the crime laboratory. The wait for the results felt endless. Everyone involved understood the importance of what they were about to learn. If the DNA didn't match, the investigation would return to square one. But if it did, one of Indiana's longest-running mysteries was finally over. Days later, the laboratory report arrived. The forensic scientists compared the newly collected DNA with the biological evidence preserved from April Tinsley's 1988 murder. It was a match. After nearly 30 years, detectives finally knew the identity of the man they had been searching for. The suspect was John D. Miller, a local truck factory worker who had quietly lived in the community while the case remained unsolved. Investigators were stunned. He had never been identified during the original investigation. He had blended into everyday life, carrying a secret that detectives had spent decades trying to uncover. But there was something even more chilling. As detectives searched deeper into the evidence, they realized the anonymous messages that had terrorized the community for years now made horrifying sense. The man they believed had hidden in plain sight all along was finally about to face justice. Before making an arrest, detectives gathered every remaining piece of evidence, determined to build a case that no defense attorney could tear apart. The moment they had worked toward for 3 decades had finally arrived. On July 15, 2018, detectives made their move. Nearly 3 decades had passed since April Tinsley was taken from her family, and the investigation had finally led them to the doorstep of John D. Miller. As police officers approached his home, there was no dramatic chase, no attempt to escape. The man detectives had spent almost 30 years searching for answered the door, unaware that his secret was about to come to an end. He was taken into custody without incident. But investigators still needed one thing. They needed to hear his explanation. Inside the interview room, detectives carefully presented the evidence. They explained how advances in DNA technology had identified him, how investigative genetic genealogy had narrowed the search, and how the discarded DNA sample had confirmed what they had suspected. At first, Miller remained calm. He listened quietly as detectives laid out decades of evidence. Then the questioning turned to the anonymous messages that had terrorized the community after April's murder. Investigators believed the same person responsible for the crime had written those disturbing notes. As the interview continued, the wall of silence that had lasted for nearly 30 years began to crack. Faced with the overwhelming forensic evidence, Miller eventually admitted responsibility for the murder of April Tinsley. For the detectives in the room, it was a moment they had imagined for decades. Some had spent most of their careers chasing a man they had never even known. Now, they were finally looking him in the eye. News of the arrest spread quickly across Indiana. For April's family, the announcement brought a mix of emotions. There was relief that the man responsible had finally been identified. But there was also sadness. No arrest, no confession, no conviction could ever bring April back. Still, after nearly 30 years of unanswered questions, the truth had finally come to light. The investigation that had haunted generations of detectives was finally approaching its conclusion. After nearly 30 years of unanswered questions, the case finally reached the courtroom. For April's family, it was the moment they had waited decades to see. Prosecutors carefully presented the evidence that had transformed one of Indiana's most haunting cold cases into a solved murder. They explained how investigators had preserved crucial forensic evidence since 1988, allowing modern DNA technology to succeed where earlier investigations could not. Experts also described how investigative genetic genealogy had identified John D. Miller as the prime suspect before detectives confirmed the match through a discarded DNA sample. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. Faced with the case against him, Miller chose not to take the trial all the way to a jury. Instead, he pleaded guilty to the murder of April Tinsley, bringing an end to decades of uncertainty. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Family members quietly wiped away tears as they listened to the details of a crime that had changed their lives forever. Many of the detectives who had worked the investigation over the years watched in silence, knowing that justice had finally caught up with a man who believed he had escaped responsibility. For them, it wasn't a celebration. It was the closing of a chapter that had haunted their careers. But before the judge delivered the final sentence, one powerful statement from April's loved ones would remind everyone in the courtroom why this case could never truly be forgotten. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. For nearly 30 years, April Tinsley's family had lived with unanswered questions, never knowing if they would see the person responsible held accountable. Now, That moment had finally arrived. After considering the evidence and Miller's guilty plea, the judge sentenced John D. Miller to 80 years in prison. For April's family, the sentence brought a measure of justice, but not peace. No number of years could replace the little girl they had lost. As family members addressed the court, they spoke about April's bright smile, her kindness, and the future that had been stolen from her. Their words were filled with heartbreak, but also gratitude for the investigators who had refused to let the case fade into history. Many detectives in the courtroom reflected on the decades they had spent searching for answers. Some had retired believing the case might never be solved. Yet because the evidence had been carefully preserved and science continued to advance, justice had finally caught up with the man responsible. As the hearing came to an end, one powerful truth remained. This wasn't just the story of a murderer being convicted. It was the story of detectives who refused to give up, even after nearly 3 decades. Although the case had finally been solved, its impact reached far beyond a single courtroom. For investigators across the United States, the murder of April Tinsley became a powerful example of how determination, preserved evidence, and advances in forensic science could bring justice, even decades later. The breakthrough in April's case inspired law enforcement agencies to take a fresh look at hundreds of cold cases that had once seemed impossible to solve. Families who had waited years for answers found new hope. Detectives who had nearly exhausted every lead were reminded that a case is never truly over as long as the evidence remains. April's family expressed their gratitude to everyone who had refused to give up. While the pain of losing her would never disappear, they finally had something they had been denied for nearly 30 years. The truth. It was a reminder that justice may be delayed, but it should never be forgotten. And as investigators closed one of Indiana's most haunting cases, they carried with them a lesson that would shape future investigations for years to come. The murder of April Tinsley remains one of the most heartbreaking cases in Indiana's history. What began as the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl became an investigation that tested generations of detectives. Some of the officers who first worked the case never lived to see it solved. Others retired believing the truth might never come. But they never gave up. Because of their determination, the careful preservation of evidence, and the incredible advances in forensic science, a killer who believed he had escaped justice was finally held accountable. April's story is more than a true crime case. It is a reminder that every victim deserves to be remembered, every family deserves answers, and no matter how much time passes, the pursuit of justice should never end. Some mysteries take years to solve, others take decades. But as this case proved, the truth has a way of finding the light. If this documentary moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next true crime documentary. And let us know in the comments. Do you believe advances in DNA technology will eventually solve more cold cases that have remained mysteries for decades? Thank you for watching Mind Blowing. Until next time, stay safe and never stop searching for the truth.